Jan Nowak swung the axe again, the bright steel biting into the frozen maple. It was November of 1872 in the north woods of Wisconsin, and the air was so cold it felt like broken glass in his lungs. The thwack of the axe was a flat, dead sound, absorbed instantly by the heavy snow and the dense, silent pines. He was a broad-shouldered man, not yet 40, but the cold had already etched lines of hard-won experience around his eyes. He stopped, breathing hard, the vapor from his mouth freezing instantly on his beard. He looked at the small pile of split wood. It was not enough. It was never enough. He was feeding a monster, and the monster lived in his own cabin. He and his wife, Elżbieta, had built their home just as their Yankee neighbors had advised. A simple, single-wall log structure, chinked with moss and mud, and heated by a modern cast-iron potbelly stove. It was a marvel of American speed, erected in a single summer. And now, in their second winter, it was proving to be a frozen coffin. He gathered the wood, his mitts stiff as boards, and trudged back to the cabin. The smoke rising from the stovepipe was thick and fast, a grey column of heat rushing straight into the sky. It was, he thought, a column of wasted life, a monument to inefficiency. He pushed open the heavy plank door. The stove itself, sitting in the middle of the room, glowed a dull, menacing red. The heat it threw was violent but shallow. 6 feet away from it, Elżbieta sat at the table, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, trying to mend a sock. Their son, Tomasz, coughed from the small loft bed, a dry, barking sound that terrified Jan. The cabin was a map of temperatures. By the stove, it was scorching, the air dry and sharp. Near the walls, the air was frigid. On the single pane of glass in the window, a thick layer of frost blotted out the world, painting intricate, beautiful, and deadly ferns of ice on the inside of the glass. Jan stacked the wood by the stove and opened the small iron door. The firebox was already depleted. He fed it more logs, and the stove roared, the metal pinging as it expanded. "It eats, Jan," Elżbieta said, her voice muffled by the blanket. She didn't look up. "It does nothing but eat." Jan nodded, his jaw tight. He walked to the west wall, the one that took the brunt of the wind. He placed his bare hand on the logs. They were cold. He could feel the wind pressing through the chinking, which had shrunk and cracked in the dry, frigid air. The cabin breathed the cold. This stove, this American invention, was designed to heat the air, but the cabin would not hold the air. It was a sieve. All night, one of them would have to wake every 2 hours to feed the stove. If they let it die, the temperature in the cabin would plummet to freezing within an hour. He looked at the stovepipe, then at the meager stone footing it sat on. He remembered his childhood in Kaszubia, in Poland. He remembered his dziadek's, grandfather's house. He remembered the peace. It was a giant, a beast of clay and tile that took up a quarter of the room. It was warm, not hot but warm, all day and all night from a single short fire. Here they were free. They had land, but they were slaves to a small, black, iron idol that demanded constant sacrifice and gave them only a small circle of fire in an ocean of cold. He touched the stone base of the stove, the small hearthstone he'd laid. It was barely warm. All the fire was escaping. This was not building. This was a slow, agonizing surrender. The cabin had been built according to the wisdom of the territory. "Build fast, build light," his neighbor, a Yankee trapper named McAllister, had told him. "Get a roof over your head before the snow flies. The stove will do the rest." And so Jan had. He had felled the pines, notched them with a simple saddle notch, and raised the walls in 3 weeks. The roof was plank, covered in rough sawn shakes. The floor was packed earth, cold and damp. The chimney was a newfangled metal pipe, light and cheap, that ran straight up through the roof. It was a cabin built for a milder climate, for men who were used to hardwood forests and winters that had a beginning and an end. This Wisconsin winter was different. It was not a season. It was an occupation. The land was held by a force that did not relent. The standard way was failing him and his family. The first sign had been the woodpile. He had cut what McAllister had called a full winter's supply, a massive rick of oak and maple. By Christmas, it was half gone. The stove's appetite was insatiable. It was not designed for efficiency. It was designed for a quick, hot fire. It burned the wood fast, and the draft pulled all the heat up the stovepipe before it could ever soak into the cabin itself. The cold was a physical presence. It found every crack. The mud and moss, chinking, which had seemed so tight in the damp autumn, dried and crumbled, opening tiny fissures to the outside. At night, Jan would lie awake, listening to the wind hissing as it infiltrated the walls. He and Elżbieta had tried everything. They had hung their blankets on the windward wall, only to find them frozen stiff in the morning. They had stuffed rags into the gaps. They had banked the outside of the cabin with a 2-foot wall of snow, which helped, but it made the cabin dark and tomb-like. The core problem remained. The stove was a sprinter, and they needed a marathon runner. It gave all its heat at once, in a way the cabin could not absorb. One night a blizzard descended. The wind screamed for 2 solid days. Jan did not sleep. He sat on a 3-legged stool, feeding log after log into the potbelly. The stovepipe glowed a dark, angry cherry red, a terrifying sight. He knew that if it got any hotter, the creosote inside would ignite, and their cabin, their entire world, would go up in flames. He kept a bucket of snow by the door, just in case. Elżbieta and Tomasz huddled in the loft, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned. Tomasz's cough grew worse, a wet rattling sound in his small chest. Jan felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just hardship, it was a design flaw, and it was going to kill them. He stared at the glowing stove. "You burn the air," he whispered to it in Polish. "You don't warm the house. You are all fire and no heat." He remembered his grandfather's Pete's Kaflowy, the tiles, the warm bench attached to it, the massive, solid presence. His grandfather would build one fire, a roaring hot blaze for an hour. Then he would close the damper, and for the next 24 hours the piece would breathe warmth. It held the heat. This American stove held nothing. It was a machine for making smoke. That night, listening to the wind trying to claw its way in and his son struggling to breathe, Jan knew. He would not survive another winter like this. He would not let his family survive another winter like this. He would tear the heart out of this cabin and build a new one. A heavy, slow, Polish heart. In the spring, when the thaw finally came, and the woods were no longer a threat but a promise, Jan travelled to the small settlement of settlers. He was not the only one who had suffered. He listened to the complaints at the general store. Men, hollow-eyed and thin, talked of wood-hungry stoves and cabins like iceboxes. They blamed the wood, the wind, the entire cursed territory. Jan listened quietly, then sought out the only other man in the area who might understand. He was an old German mason named Oskar Schmidt, who lived alone by the river, tending a small quarry. Jan found him splitting granite. He was a man made of stone himself, it seemed. Jan, in broken German mixed with English, tried to explain. He didn't just want a fireplace, he wanted a mass. Schmidt stopped his work, wiping his brow. He looked at Jan with sharp blue eyes. "You mean a Kachelofen," he said, the word sounding strange and ancient. "A tile stove." Jan nodded eagerly. "Yes, but no tiles, just stone, clay, something to hold the fire." Schmidt grunted. He walked over to his own small, rough-hewn shed. Inside, it was shockingly comfortable. In the corner stood a simple rectangular prism of fieldstone and clay mortar. It was not a stove, it was a block. "Like this," Schmidt said, patting its side. It was cool to the touch. "The Americans," Schmidt scoffed, gesturing toward the settlement. "They want fire. They want to see the flame. They build a big open hole in the wall, and the fire sucks all the warm air out of the house. Or," he pointed at Jan's cabin in the distance, "they get a little iron box. It burns the air. It makes the air sick. All heat goes up the pipe. Stupid." He then explained, with his hands, with gestures, with charcoal on a piece of wood. The secret was not the fire, the secret was the smoke. "The smoke is hot," he said, drawing a diagram. "You must not let the hot smoke escape." He drew a firebox. Then he drew a long, winding path. Up, down, sideways, up again. A labyrinth. You must make the smoke work. Make it crawl. Make it touch every stone. By the time the smoke leaves, he pointed to the top, it should be cool. It has given all its heat to the masse. Jan stared at the drawing. It was exactly what he remembered. The piece wasn't a stove, it was a heat exchanger, a thermal battery. "Masse," Schmidt said, thumping his chest. "You need mass, stone, clay, weight. The iron stove is light. It forgets the fire in an hour. A stone stove. A stone stove remembers the fire for a day." Jan also learned from the land itself. He had watched the sun in the fall, noticing how a south-facing granite outcrop would be warm to the touch hours after sunset, while the earth around it was already cold. He saw how the snow melted first on the south side of the hills. The earth itself was a battery if you knew how to use it. Schmidt gave him one last piece of advice. "Find good clay, not just mud. You need clay that fires, and build it in the center so it warms all the air, not just one wall." Jan walked home, his mind ablaze. He wasn't just going to build a stove, he was going to build a machine. A heavy, slow, brilliant machine for capturing heat. He would rip the iron heart out of his cabin and replace it with one of stone. That summer, the cabin was a scene of controlled destruction. Jan waited until the weather was warm and stable, then moved Elżbieta and Tomasz into a temporary lean-to. With a grim satisfaction, he dismantled the potbelly stove and its flimsy, dangerous pipe. He sold it at the trading post for a few bags of flour. Then, in the very center of his cabin, he began to dig. His neighbors thought he had gone mad. "Jan, you're building a root cellar indoors?" McAllister asked, leaning on the doorframe. Jan just shook his head, his face slick with sweat. "A foundation." The hole grew 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 4 feet deep, until he hit solid clay subsoil. He spent a week hauling fieldstone and gravel from the riverbed, filling the pit, tamping it down layer by layer until he had a massive, stable footing that was completely isolated from the cabin's dirt floor. This thing would weigh tons, and it could not be allowed to settle. Upon this he laid the great hearthstone. It was a single, flat slab of granite he and his ox had dragged 1/2 mile from the woods. This stone was the symbolic base, the first piece of the puzzle. His plan, sketched on birch bark and seared into his mind, was obsessive. He had to solve multiple problems at once. First, the firebox. It had to be small, deep, and lined with something that could withstand intense, repeated heat. He had found a vein of blue-gray clay by the river, the kind Schmidt had described. He spent weeks digging it, hauling it, and mixing it with sand, testing the consistency. He formed rough bricks and baked them in a massive bonfire, creating his own crude fire brick. He built the firebox, small and tight, with a small iron door he'd salvaged. Then, the labyrinth. This was the genius of it. From the top of the firebox, he didn't build a chimney. He built a channel that went up for 3 feet, made of his heaviest stones. Then he capped it, forcing the smoke and hot gas to travel down a second parallel channel. This meant the heat had to fight its own buoyancy, moving slowly, giving up its energy to the dividing wall of stone. At the bottom, the channel turned 90 degrees and ran horizontally for 6 feet, forming a low, wide bench. This was the leżanka, the heated bench he remembered from Poland. Only after the smoke had travelled the length of this bench did he allow it to enter a final vertical flue, which then, finally, connected to a new, safe, clay-lined chimney through the roof. The entire structure was a massive, serpentine trap for heat. He encased the whole assembly, firebox, flues and bench, in a thick outer shell of fieldstone and clay mortar, layer upon layer. It was not beautiful like the tiled piece of the old country. It was primal. It was a rectangular beast of stone, 6 feet long on the bench, 3 feet wide and 5 feet high. It dominated the small cabin. It was the new center of their world. By late September it was done. It stood silent and grey, smelling of damp clay and minerals. Jan let it cure for 3 long weeks, lighting only small, smouldering fires of twigs to slowly dry the hundreds of pounds of water locked in the mortar. Elżbieta looked at it with a mixture of hope and fear. "It's so big, Jan." "It must be," he said, tapping its solid flank. "It has to remember." The work was brutal, relentless and isolating. Jan's hands, already calloused, became cracked and worn down to the quick from working with the wet clay and the sharp-edged stone. He hauled every rock himself, fitting them with a patient, stubborn precision. The clay mortar, a mix of the river clay, sand and chopped straw, he mixed with his bare feet, pounding and turning it until it had the consistency of thick dough. Each stone was set, levelled and mortared, the gaps filled, the surfaces smoothed. He was not just building, he was sculpting. He was creating a single monolithic object. The firebox was the most difficult part. He lined his homemade fire bricks with another, finer layer of pure clay slip, smoothing it with his hands until it was a seamless chamber. He knew this box would have to endure temperatures far higher than the old stove ever did. This was by design. He wanted a fire that would burn fast and white-hot, consuming the wood completely, leaving almost no smoke, only pure heat. This clean combustion would also prevent the build-up of dangerous creosote in the long, winding flues. The labyrinth itself was a puzzle of fluid dynamics he solved with instinct. He made the channels wide enough to draw, but narrow enough to create turbulence, forcing the hot gases to tumble and lick every possible square inch of stone. His neighbors, who had watched his progress with detached amusement, now became openly skeptical. "You'll never get a fire to draw down, Nowak," McAllister declared, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground. "Fire goes up. Everyone knows that. You'll fill your cabin with smoke, and that'll be the end of it." Another settler, a Swede named Larsson, was concerned for Jan's sanity. "It's a tomb, Jan," he said quietly. "You've built a tomb in your house, and it takes up all the room. Where will you live?" Jan simply nodded and kept working. He knew what they didn't. The draw wouldn't come from the fire. It would come from the chimney. The tall, vertical column of the final flue, once warmed, would create a powerful siphon, a negative pressure that would pull the smoke and fire through the entire convoluted system. The fire wouldn't have to push, it would be pulled. Elżbieta, though worried, became his most crucial partner. She hauled water, mixed batches of mortar, and handed him the stones. She saw the logic in it. She, too, remembered the old ways. "My babcia," she said one evening, her hands covered in clay. She would bake the bread in the peace oven after. The fire was out. The heat stayed until morning. By the first frost of October, the structure was complete. It was massive, solid, and silent. It had a small, cast-iron door for the firebox, low to the ground. Higher up there was a second, smaller door for cleaning the horizontal flue. And at the very top, where the smoke finally entered the chimney, he installed a simple, heavy metal plate as a damper. This was the most important part. Once the fire was out, This damper would be closed, sealing the entire mass, trapping every last vestige of warmth within the stone. For weeks they lived around it as it cured. The drying fires were frustratingly small, just handfuls of kindling. The cabin was still cold. Jan was patient. He would tap the stone, listening. The sound changed as it dried, from a dull thud to a clearer, harder thock. He was waiting. He was listening for the stone to be ready. Elżbieta moved their table next to the bench. Tomasz, curious, laid his hand on it. "It's not warm, Papa." "It will be," Jan promised. "Wait." The grey, damp smell slowly faded, replaced by the faint, baked scent of minerals and earth. The nights grew colder. The first snows fell. McAllister's stovepipe was already puffing grey smoke day and night. Jan Nowak waited for the first true, deep cold. It came in mid-December. The sky turned a flat metallic grey, and the temperature dropped to 25 below zero. The wind, no longer a breeze, became a physical force that battered the small cabin. This was the test. His neighbours were already in a state of siege, their cabins buttoned up, their wood piles shrinking visibly. Jan, with a sense of ceremony, went to his woodpile. He brought in not a large load, but a small, precise one, dry, split birch. He opened the small iron door of the firebox. He opened the main damper. He laid the wood inside the deep, narrow box, lit it, and closed the door. For a moment, nothing. Then, a faint whoosh as the chimney flue caught the draught. The sound was entirely different from the old stove. It wasn't a roar, it was a jet. The small firebox was pulling air with incredible force, creating a miniature furnace. The fire burned with a white-hot intensity, the wood crackling and vanishing with astonishing speed. Jan stood and listened. Elżbieta watched, her hands pressed together. Tomasz sat on his stool, wide-eyed. They were not watching a fire, they were listening to a machine. Jan did not add more wood. He let the entire charge burn down. In 90 minutes, the inferno was reduced to a bed of glowing white-hot coals. The wood was almost completely consumed. There was very little smoke. Using a heavy glove, Jan reached up and pushed the chimney damper shut. Clang! The cabin was plunged into a profound silence. The only sound was the wind howling outside. The fire was out. The iron door of the firebox was already cooling. McAllister, trudging by to check his traps, would have seen no smoke from the chimney and assumed the Nowaks had frozen to death. 10 minutes passed. Elżbieta looked at Jan, her face filled with doubt. "Jan?" He raised a hand, waiting. He walked to the stone bench, the leżanka. He placed his palm flat against it. A slow, subtle smile spread across his face. "Here," he said. Elżbieta touched it. Her eyes widened. It was not hot. It was warm. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be coming from the very center of the stone. An hour later, the entire 5-ton mass of the piece was radiating heat. It was not the scorching, dry blast of the iron stove. It was a gentle, steady, radiant warmth. Like the sun on a spring day, it filled the entire cabin. The frost on the window didn't just stop spreading, it began to melt. The air was warm, but it was also fresh. The piece wasn't burning the air, it was warming the room. That night, for the first time in a Wisconsin winter, they slept. They slept through the night. Jan did not wake to feed the fire. When they awoke 8 hours later, the blizzard was still raging, the wind was still screaming, and the cabin was warm. The stone piece was still, impossibly, breathing heat into the room. Tomasz, who had crawled onto the leżanka bench, was asleep in his nightshirt, his cheeks flushed and healthy. Jan fired the stove once that morning, another 90-minute hot blaze, and once again in the evening. 2 small, fast fires were all it took to keep the cabin comfortable for 24 hours. He had done it. He hadn't just built a stove, he had built a fortress. Word spread. But not as words. It spread as a rumor, as a physical shock. His neighbor, Sven Larsson, hammered on the door during the second day of the blizzard. He was covered in snow, his beard a mask of ice. He had come to check on them, fearing the worst, having seen no smoke. "Jan, are you alive? Your fire is out." Jan opened the door, and a cloud of warm, comfortable air spilled out onto the porch. Sven stared, dumbfounded. Jan was in his shirt sleeves. Elżbieta was kneading bread on the table. "Come in, Sven," Jan said. The Swede stepped inside and stopped dead. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his eyes wide. He looked at the silent grey stone beast. He looked at the family. "But there is no fire," he stammered. "How?" Jan smiled and pointed to the bench. "Sit." Sven cautiously sat on the leżanka. The warmth soaked through his frozen pants instantly. He let out a sound that was half sigh, half groan. "It is like the hearths in the old country," he whispered, "but more." He stayed for an hour, basking in the warmth, his coat and hat in a puddle of melted snow by the door. "You are burning a quarter of the wood I am," Sven calculated, "and you are twice as warm." The next spring, Sven Larsson was Jan's first customer. "Build me one," he said, offering to trade a milk cow and his labor. Jan agreed. Sven's cabin was smaller, so they built a simpler, square version without the long bench. It worked just as well. The following year, 2 German families, the Bauers and the Kleins, who were new to the territory, came to him. They had heard the stories. Jan helped them build their piece before they even finished their cabin walls. They built the hearth first, the heart of the home, and raised the cabin around it. The Nowak stove, as it came to be known, began to change the landscape. You could tell a Nowak cabin in winter. Its chimney puffed a clean, hot breath for an hour in the morning and an hour at night, and then stood silent. The other cabins leaked a constant, lazy stream of grey, wasteful smoke all day long. Jan's design was adapted. Some built it into a central wall, warming 2 rooms at once. Others, like the wealthy Yankee landowner, had him build an ornate version with a second, smaller chamber for baking bread. The innovation spread, person to person, family to family. It became vernacular wisdom, a piece of Polish engineering translated for the American frontier. Decades later, travelers passing through that valley in the dead of winter would remark how these cabins felt different, how they felt solid, permanent, and unusually comfortable, as one land surveyor wrote. They didn't know they were feeling the legacy of Jan Nowak, and the quiet, radiant memory of a fire stored in stone. What Jan had rediscovered was a forgotten law of thermodynamics. The American cast-iron stove was a creature of the Industrial Revolution. It was fast, light, cheap, and disposable. It was a convection heater. It heated the air, which is the least efficient way to heat a leaky, uninsulated box. The air, once heated, would rise and escape, pulling cold air in to replace it. This created the very drafts Jan had been fighting. It was a vicious cycle of heating and losing, heating and losing. It was also incredibly inefficient. More than 70% of the heat from the wood went directly up the stovepipe, along with a cloud of unburnt gases, smoke, that would coat the flue in flammable creosote. Jan's piece was the opposite. It was a radiant heater, but more accurately, it was a high-mass heat storage system. The fire itself was just the charging mechanism. The small, deep insulated firebox created a secondary combustion effect. The fire burned so hot that it consumed not just the wood, but the gases from the wood. It was a clean, high-efficiency burn, extracting nearly all the available energy. The genius, however, was in the labyrinth. Those long, winding flues were a contraflow heat exchanger. The 1,500-degree gases from the fire were forced to take a 20-foot journey through the stone mass. By the time the exhaust finally left the chimney, it was often less than 300 degrees. Where did all that heat go? It was harvested. It was transferred by conduction into the tons of stone and clay. The PC's was a thermal battery. Once the fire was out and the damper was closed, that massive 5-ton battery began to discharge its stored energy. It didn't heat the air, it radiated heat. These long-wave thermal rays traveled through the room, warming every object they touched. The walls, the floor, the furniture, and the people. A radiant heated room feels warm and comfortable even at a lower air temperature. With no drafts and no dry, scorched air, Jan Nowak, with no schooling, just the memory of his ancestors and the sharp sting of failure, had engineered a clean-burning, high-efficiency, passive thermal storage device that modern engineers would marvel at. He had solved the problem not with more fire, but with smarter fire. He had chosen mass over speed, and in doing so, had conquered the cold. Jan Nowak lived to see his grandchildren born in that same cabin, warmed by the same silent stone heart he had built with his own hands. The peace outlasted him, and his children, continuing to radiate heat from short, hot fires for over a century. The great hearthstone he had laid became the true center of the family's life, a place to sit, to dry mitts, to tell stories, to survive. Jan's innovation was not, in the end, an invention. It was an act of translation. He had carried an ancient, heavy, slow wisdom from the old world and planted it in the thin, fast soil of the new. He had looked at the abundant, endless forest, and instead of seeing fuel to be wasted, he saw a resource to be respected. He understood what his neighbors did not. The enemy was not the cold, for the cold was a constant. The enemy was waste, wasted heat, wasted wood, and the wasted human labor spent cutting it. His oversized hearth was not a monument to excess. It was, in fact, the most frugal and efficient of all designs. It turned a short burst of violent work into a long, steady embrace of comfort. It was a design born of scarcity and respect. It taught a lesson that echoed far beyond the Wisconsin woods. Do not simply fight the elements. Build a vessel to understand and contain their opposites. Do not seek the comfort of a constant visible fire. Seek instead to capture and store its memory. In a world that prizes speed, the greatest power often lies in slow, deliberate, and heavy mass. The solutions we often need are not brand new. They are old, forgotten wisdom, buried in the earth, waiting for hands strong enough to dig and a mind patient enough to rebuild them.